Last time I talked a little bit about the procedural generation system I am working on for Amy's World. Well, I spent the last 2 weeks fleshing that out to a point where I have a fully generated playable new map in the game. Not the final content, but it's a little story that can be explored using the card game mechanics. So I essentially have been thinking and programming all the time. There isn't really much in terms of new Godot findings I can share today. Instead, I want to talk a little more about the procedural narrative system I'm building. This is all in the making, and I'm probably going to redesign most of it multiple times, but if you're into procedural narratives, this might be interesting for you. The whole thing revolves around events and accounts. As I mentioned before, the system is inspired by Caves of Cod in that the narrative relates events that happened in the past through historical accounts the player encounters while exploring the map. These events are, in my case, centered around the discovery and fate of a historical artifact the player needs to retrieve. Very briefly, a tiny history simulation randomly picks events based on existing state and preconditions, then adds them to the timeline. These events update the system state, which in turn influences conditions for the next round of choosing events. When that timeline has been generated, I create historical accounts from the events. It's a separate step in my system, because not every event should be represented on the map, or one event could be expressed as multiple accounts. For instance, an NPC could point the way to a site, and then there also is the actual site on the map. Finally, the accounts are placed on the map in the form of interactable items. Events and accounts make use of text patterns to add randomized names and such. Apart from the text, there are a ton of illustrations that need to be made too, for the player cards, the artifacts, and the sites the player encounters. I haven't quite figured out yet how to make them generic but interesting enough to accommodate all the situations the player may come across. For now I'm just drawing stuff as it comes up, but I think I really need a better strategy here. It's not hard to see how that system can easily create a random mess of events with no story arc whatsoever. Well, it might sometimes generate an interesting story, but not reliably. The stories generated in this way can feel really empty. It's kind of disappointing when you realize it's all just a bunch of random text snippets with no intent or message whatsoever. So what can we do to add direction and purpose to the generated stories? My first step after building the base system was to actually write down a little story of the kind I want to have in the game, then analyze and dissect it. This story isn't big. I spent around 20 minutes on a somewhat silly little tale about this person who invented an amazingly powerful lockpick, which over time becomes a sacred relic, a symbol of unlocking secrets and revelation. Writing down an actual story gave me some material that told me what the system actually needs to be capable of. That's a lot better than just imagining everything that might be cool to implement. I have a background in software development, so I love building systems. I always have to keep myself in check to not just create amazingly flexible and powerful architectures forever instead of an actual game. I dissected the story into events such as the person being born, joining a research institution, opening up a business, then a church claiming to have found the sacred lockpick, and so on. All these events translate more or less directly into accounts on the map. A house, a monument, the place where the actual artifact can be found. So what about purpose and direction? The way I am going about this now is conditions on the biographical events enforce a certain order, but also allow for some variation. For example, you don't want the inventor to randomly die 1 year after birth without having accomplished anything interesting. On the other hand, the invention might happen before or after he maybe went to university. As another measure, I group all of the accounts into acts. This is basically an index into the map section where I want to place things, so the player encounters story snippets in an order that makes sense. This is still just one little story, so you might ask, what's the point? The bigger idea here is to feed more and more story snippets into the system over time and let them interact to create larger stories with unexpected twists. The next obvious question is, how does all of this tie into gameplay? I want the narrative to be an integral part of gameplay, so I have encoded small challenges into some of the accounts, where you need matching cards to solve the challenge. The cards work a little like inventory items in a classical adventure game in that way. Solving a challenge moves the story forward by letting the player move further down the map, eventually unlocking the next act. I'm expecting to add a lot more here, but it's simple and effective enough for me to move forward. After all the work on systems, I really want to think about the story content in more detail and add mood and visual interest to the game world. Next time I can hopefully show you some of that. And that's all I have for today. Bye!